Hey everybody, this is Jerry. Welcome back to the Auto Layout video tutorial series. In the previous video, you had a quick look at creating constraints in Interface Builder. In this video tutorial, I'm going to dive a little deeper into the different ways to create constraints in Interface Builder. I'll cover the different ways you can use control drag between views to create constraints. Then, I'll talk about the auto layout buttons in the lower right corner of the editor. Finally, I'll talk about using container views to create constraints that apply to a group of views. Control drag, or right-click and drag, is a quick, easy way to create a single constraint or even a couple of constraints between two views. In the previous tutorial, you saw that the options presented are filtered by the direction you drag. That can make it easier to narrow down the options and find just the one you're looking for. You already saw how to control drag between items in the editor, but there are other options as well. There are times when it can be difficult to drag between items in the editor. For example, the view you want to drag from or to may be behind other views or off the screen. A very common case is when you have a background image the full size of your view. If you want to create a constraint to the parent view, it's practically impossible to drag to it instead of the background image. One other option is to control drag between items in the document outline. The options presented here are not filtered by direction like they are in the first case. This can be good if you're trying to make constraints in several directions, like the top and bottom of a view. You can even control drag between the editor and the document outline. There's no difference to the constraints that get created with these various options. They're really just each convenient in different situations, and you should pick the one that suits you best. Note that when dragging in the editor, it's only required to drag over any point in the view. If you're trying to create a constraint to the top of the super view, you don't have to drag all the way to the top, just anywhere over the super view to create the constraint. One other important point. You can only create constraints between two views that are in the same view hierarchy. You can't create constraints between views in two different view controllers, for example. If you want to create a quick constraint between two views, control drag is the way to go. But frequently, when you're working with a view, you want to create constraints between it and various different neighboring views. Maybe the super view on the top and leading edge, but then a different view on the trailing edge and another one to the bottom. Rather than control dragging several times between each of those, the pin button really comes in handy here. There are several buttons for auto layout in the lower right-hand corner of the editor. We'll talk about the others in a minute, but the one with the box in the middle, some people call it the TIE Fighter button. That's the pin button. When you click that, you get a popover view that you can use to create several constraints at once. At the top of this view, the white box represents the selected view. The four I-beams represent constraints on all four edges of the view. To create a constraint, click the I-beam for the edges you want, and the red dotted line will turn solid. The text field next to the I-beam represents the distance for the constraint. So here, you would be creating a leading constraint and a trailing constraint, each 49 points from the super view. To change the distance, you just type in a new value. You can also click the arrow for more options, and I'll talk more about those in the demo. When you're creating constraints between a view and its super view, you can create a constraint to the edge of the super view or to its margins. Each view has margins that define how far from the edge it would like its subviews to be, but you have full control over whether to ignore those margins and create a constraint directly to the view instead, using the Constrain to Margins checkbox. If the constraints you're adding here don't match the current frames of the views, the Update Frames option down at the bottom allows you to modify the frames to match the constraints. You can choose to update the frames just for views that are getting new constraints, or for all views in the view controller. The next button I'm going to talk about is the Align button. That's the one with two boxes and a line next to them. With multiple views selected, this popover lets you align the leading, trailing, top, and/or bottom edges of the views. You can also offset the alignment by a fixed amount. For example, if you want one view to always be 10 points indented from the leading edge of another view, you would create a leading edge constraint here and type 10 for the value. You can also align their centers horizontally and vertically, or align their baselines. Baseline alignment is useful for views that have different heights, but you want the text in them to be aligned, like a label and a button. Okay, all those options align between two or more views. Remember, constraints are between one or two views, so if you have more than two views selected here, you're really creating multiple constraints. Now, I really use these bottom two more frequently than the rest. If you want to center a view horizontally or vertically in its super view, use these. And the update frames behavior is the same as in the pin popover. Those are the two main dialogues for creating constraints. So what are these other options? Well, the one with the triangle is for resolving auto layout issues, and I'll cover all these in the demo. And the last button is new for iOS 9 and is used to quickly embed views in a UI stack view. For more on how that works, be sure to watch the UI stack view video tutorial series. For this demo, we're going to build this handy form that stores the results of your favorite internet quizzes. And whenever I get a design like this, I like to look at it and sort of deconstruct it, look at the controls, the views that are going to stay together, and build constraints relative to the views that are going to live together as a group. So in this case, we have this one group, and so I'm going to build constraints between this top text view and the super view, and then I'm going to build constraints from the other views to that text view. And we'll look at the flexibility that that gives us in a little bit, but let's get started. So we're starting from the results of our last demo that has the buttons already on it. And we'll start just by laying out the controls that we want on the view and naming them what we want and positioning them approximately where they should go. So I'll start with that. Once I position these approximately, then I'll just duplicate them to create the rest of them. I'll use Command D to duplicate that. And then we'll change these label values to what we want them to be. Which pop star are you? How many states have you visited? Which rapper are you? And what's your real age? You can see this isn't perfect. I've got some views overlapping each other, but that's okay. The constraints are going to take care of that. The first thing I'm going to do is create constraints to this top text field. And we saw previously how to use control drag to do that. You can also use control drag in the document outline to create constraints, but we're going to create constraints using the pin button. So with this field selected, I click the pin button, and let's talk about this menu for a minute. This box represents the view that I have selected, in this case this text field. And these four I-beams represent constraints to each edge to the nearest neighbor by default. So this leading I-beam represents a constraint between the text field and the nearest neighbor to the leading edge, which is this first name label. If I click the drop-down menu, it shows me some more options. The text field by default has the current value, and I can reset it to the current canvas value here if I change it to something different. But I can also use the standard value, and Apple has guidelines for how far views should be from each other. And so if you want to use those guidelines, then you can just choose this use standard value. Or if you want to create a constraint to a view other than the default, the views in that direction are all listed here. So the views in the up direction for this up I-beam. In this case, we want to create constraints for the top, the leading, and the trailing edge, and we'll use the standard value for this, and we'll leave that one at 0. If the constrain to margins checkbox is checked, any constraints between this view and its super view will be created to that super view's margins. If you want to create the constraint to the super view's edge, then you would clear this checkbox. And for the top level view, the most common case for that is going to be if you want something to take up the full size of the parent view, like a background image view, or even just an image that's not for the background, but that you want it to go edge to edge. Then you would create the constraints to the super view's edge instead of it to its margins. Let's talk about these other options real quick, even though we're not going to use them in this particular view. Width and height, create explicit width and height constraints on this view, and I'd usually try to avoid these because it sort of circumvents the purpose of using auto layout. So auto layout is for creating a flexible layout to handle different view sizes or different flexible situations. If I've got text that's longer or shorter because it's being translated or the view's being rotated or something like that, I want my view to expand or contract to handle that situation. And if I create an explicit width or height constraint, I'm telling it, don't allow this view to be flexible, keep it to be exactly this explicit size. So I usually try to avoid those. If you have multiple views selected, you can create constraints to make them equal widths or heights. And the aspect ratio constraint keeps, no matter what size this view is, it'll keep the same aspect ratio or multiple of width to height. And we'll look at that a little bit more in a later tutorial. You can also, while you're creating these constraints, quickly align one edge. We'll look at another option for creating multiple alignments in a minute, but that's just a quick, convenient way to align one edge. And then let's look at the options for update frames. If the constraints that I'm creating are going to cause the frame of this view to be different than what the constraints define, then I might want to update that frame to now match the constraints that I have defined. And here I can choose to do that for views that are getting new constraints or all views in the container, updating their frames to match the constraints. So I have the constraints that I want defined, and so I go ahead and add those using this add button down at the bottom. Now we want the rest of the text fields to be constrained to their top neighbor. So I'm just going to use command click to select each of these. And if I have multiple views selected and I click the pin button, any constraints that I create in here are going to be created on each of the views that I have selected. In this case, I want a top constraint and I want this to use the standard value. So I add those. Because I haven't completed my layout yet, even though it's indicating errors, I'm not worried about that because I'm not done yet. Let's look at the align button real quick. So I also want, in addition to the vertical spacing between each of these, I want to align the leading and trailing edge of all of these text fields. So I want to select that last one as well, using command click, and then align their leading and trailing edges and add those 10 constraints. Now I want to create a constraint between each text field and the label next to it. And I want their baselines to align. If there's text in this text field, I want that text to line up with the text of the label. I don't want the bottom or tops of the views to be aligned because then the text wouldn't be aligned. So I'll create baseline alignment between each of these. And then I want all the labels to align as well on their leading and trailing edge. So I select all of those. And again, I use the align menu, leading and trailing edge. I also want them to have a standard distance to the super view. So again, because these are all aligned with each other, I just want to create that constraint on one view, the first name label, and the rest of them will follow. So I pin that to the leading edge and add one constraint. Now let's take a look at the Resolve Auto Layout Issues button. I have the constraints that I want defined, but because I didn't get everything exactly in the same place that I have it defined when I dragged them out and just roughly position them, they're not where the constraints define them to be, but I now have all the constraints that I want. So if I click the Resolve Auto Layout Issues button, this has two sections. The top section applies only to the selected views, and the bottom selection will apply to all views in the view controller. And this Update Frames option is the one that I want, but I want it for all the views in the view controller. So it's updated all the frames to match the constraints, and everything is happy. Let's take a look at how flexible this layout is. If I want more room in between this group of controls on the top of the view, maybe I need to insert something above this group, an image or something like that, I can go in here and I can modify just one constraint. I find the top space to the super view constraint. And if I edit this one constraint, the whole group of views moves with it. Similarly, let me undo that. Let's say our designer says we don't like the abbreviated version of these labels. We want to use a longer label. Let's change this label to how many states have you visited? And let's update frames again. Sometimes when I click this button and all the options are grayed out, I just need to click back in the view and click it again, and it'll enable those options. So we update all the frames, and look, all our text fields are still aligned, and we've got enough space between them and the text. So let's look in the assistant editor at preview and just make sure this looks right on all the different form factors we're going to support. So this is the iPhone 4-inch. Oh, the label's just too long, and that makes the text fields too short. So we're going to change that back. I'll just use Command Z to change this back. And the preview updates, and that's enough space to put values in the text fields, and so we'll just keep that label. Let me just make a little room here. I'm going to use Command Option 0 to hide that left side, and we'll click this button to hide the right side. I always like to take a look in the preview assistant editor just to make sure that everything looks right before I start running and debugging my layout. If I rotate to landscape, I can see everything looks good. It's going all the way to the edge. The buttons are sized right. The labels are sized right. Let's contrast this with this project I have created. Here I have a layout very similar to the previous one we were looking at, but in this case I have constraints created between each of these views and their surrounding views, and not between each of these views and the top views. And let's look at how flexible this is. So if I modify this top space constraint to make some room, well, the text fields are all constrained to each other, so they just move down, but the labels didn't go with them. And if I wanted to change this text and update the frames, only the one text field is modified. None of the rest of the text fields go with it. They're not aligned to each other. That's why I like to create constraints between each of the fields to one sort of anchor view instead of just to each neighbor. Remember, constraints apply to one view or two views at the most. So if I want to create a constraint between a group of views, for example, if I want to vertically center these views, then I have to first embed them in a container view, and then I can create a constraint between that container view and the super view. And that's what you'll do in the challenge.
Well, that's it for this video tutorial. As always, we'd like to leave you with a challenge. For this challenge, you're going to take the project from the demo and center the controls vertically. If you run into any trouble, check out the challenge document. I hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.